Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle CFO Summit. My name is Nick with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our moderator, Anais Lempereur, Senior Vice President, Finance, Pluto TV, Paramount. We are excited to have Anais and our panelists for a panel discussion titled How Modern Day CFOs Are Prioritizing Growth. Welcome, Anais. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I definitely think this is probably one of the most fun ways of earning some CPA credits because we've got an amazing panel today. We're going to be hearing from Kyra Coker, and then we're also going to be meeting Joshua Ketter. Before I pass it over to you, Kyra, to give us some introductions, I'd love to just take a moment to introduce myself. So I am the head of finance for Pluto TV, which is an advertising-supported streaming service for Paramount Global. I am based in Los Angeles, and today, since we're going to be talking about growth, we're also asking our panelists after they introduce themselves to talk to us a little bit about sort of like what's happening in their industries. It's definitely a very interesting but also challenging time for a lot of CFOs. Speaking for myself, on the television side, we have a double strike happening, first time in 63 years. So lots of things, which are sort of new to a lot of us on how we're learning how to cope with challenges and also opportunities happening. So with that said, Kyra, I'd love to pass it over to you.
Sure, thanks. So Kyra Coker, I'm with National Roofing Partners. We're a single source commercial roofing company that services all 50 states in the United States for anything related to commercial roofing. I have been in construction finance since 2005, and prior to that was in a publicly held payphone company that kind of saw through the different stages of that company, which gave me a lot of good experience for the rest of my career. In my current position as CFO and company integrator for the company, I oversee the finance and HR, IT, shared services function of the business. And then I also oversee the services side of the business. And ultimately, as the company integrator, I kind of sit behind the scenes and make sure that everything is working well together.
Spin doctor, basically, at the back, making sure it's all working. Love it. Joshua, you wanna take it?
Awesome. I don't have anything as fancy as integrator. I think that's a fantastic title, by the way, Kyra. But I'm Joshua Ketter. I'm our CFO here at Spreetail. Spreetail is one of the largest e-commerce enablers in the world. We are about $1 billion. I've been in e-commerce myself for close to 2 decades now. Most of my career was at Amazon.com. I used to oversee the fulfillment cost planning and analysis for them. And then I led our technology cost at Amazon, supporting the CIO. After that, I spent about 3 years at Target. I was effectively the CFO of Target.com. We helped grow that from about $1 billion to a little over 10 billion plus. And then I retired. I always joked, though, that if I could take the best parts of Amazon, the best parts of Target, and help a company go public, I would come out of retirement only for that. And so that is retail for me. We are a Midwest company with good values. We like to partner with people the way and care about our people the way that Target did. We like to move fast and solve challenges the way that Amazon does. So I love that. I'm here to help them do that. In terms of what I would say my industry and kind of dynamics that we are facing, I would say the last year, a lot of the folks in our industry would describe it as the winter of e-commerce. We were used to growing 15 to 20% a year as a whole. Unfortunately, post-pandemic, bullwhip happened, and a lot of consumers went from, I would say, the bubble of acquiring goods because they were staying at home more to now traveling and spending money on services and other things as opposed to durable goods, which is really my space in particular. As well as we have the back end of the global supply chain crisis, where containers went from like $2,000 to $20,000. And when you're a heavy import business like us, that's massive. I mean, it cost me close to $100 million additional, and we had to absorb that. And when demand oscillates a little bit, retails get compressed. So I'd say a lot of folks in our space are seeing a large margin compression because of that. And we're working through massive amounts of unhealthy inventory because everybody also saw all the buying post-pandemic that was not sustainable, which we all knew wasn't sustainable. We thought it might just absorb, slowly over time. And it ended up being more of like a cliff. And all of a sudden consumers flip to services. Everybody's still got all these goods coming through the log jam of this global supply chain. And now all retailers are pretty much overstocked and trying to right size their inventory. So we're in a similar boat. We've been working through that. Definitely interesting and fun times. These are the challenges that we all get paid for and live for. And so I'm certainly enjoying solving it. I'd say we're well into it, but those are some of the dynamics in my space, if that's helpful. Anais.
That's super helpful. I think a lot of us have sort of heard inklings of a lot of what you're saying, but it's really great that we're going to get to learn from you two today, seeing what it's like on the ground. So we've sort of I've sort of thought about this in sort of 3 sections today. So we're going to start with performance. We're going to talk a little bit about process and then people. So let's start off with the performance side. So in your experience, maybe Joshua, you can start us up, and then Kyra, you can go after. How have you seen finance evolving in the last couple of years, like specifically your function, as you are having to flex to prioritizing new growth opportunities, but also new challenges which are coming through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say maybe over the course of probably a decade, the one area that I've seen finance have to evolve the most, at least in my space, I'm sure it varies by industry, but in e-commerce and digital specifically, we have to get much more into the details of the data. I see SQL and technology type-esque skill sets becoming more and more commonplace in my finance teams, because not only do we need to understand how to source the data quickly because it's evolving rapidly, but we need to understand how it's calculated. Is the data of sufficient quality to inform the decisions that we're making? And so we have to become much more of, I would almost consider MIS, management information systems experts. And I think that's an important talent and skill set that I've seen grown in my team and has changed the way I think about operating. Beyond that, and kind of what you're describing is, I would say, the last few years around growth and how we have to pivot. I also think that's the pivots I've had to make are consistent with how I've seen finance evolve more over the course of time. I think this probably goes across industries, which is being more of a strategic partner, right? We're kind of moving from the stage of being more accounting oriented and accounting for things to more, how do we make sure we're making the right decisions and investments as a business, and being a little more strategically minded, particularly around growth or pivoting when you run into these odd challenges like a pandemic. And that's led to, I would say, being a lot closer to the business. To maybe give you some examples, I think your last question was, how do we prioritize new growth initiatives? Is that did I hear you right? Great. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so for me in particular, I think of prioritizing growth initiatives in a few different senses. So one, I would look at what are the things I like to use the Eisenhower matrix a little bit here, which is, what are the things that have the potential greatest impact, but also have the least amount of effort? And then I assign kind of a probability, my best guess based off of how complex that is and how much do I believe in the business case, how tight is it? And then I kind of try and prioritize the things that I think I can move the quickest on. They're going to have the most impact for the business, and they're most probable. Maybe an example of an instance where we had to do that. I was looking at my out of stocks for our business, and it started climbing up close to 20%, especially when we were going through the pandemic and had a lot of supply shortages. I knew that for us, that was worth well over $100 million of growth opportunity. And that was a very nascent one that I knew if we just applied operational focus, we could move the needle very quickly. But it required me to get in with our inventory leaders and understand what are their processes, how are they getting in front of that, and how are we balancing it so that we're not overbuying inventory and overcorrecting, but we're getting more accurate at a SKU level. And I realized we had poor order sequencing. We were just ordering on a set order cadence. Nowhere were we looking at when demand changed, were we adjusting our order point to say, oh, it's moving faster, we need to order earlier. So we made some strategic changes there and operational changes as well. And we're able to increase our sales by $50 to $100 million within the matter of a few months. So that's probably an instance where maybe in the past, the CFO would have just pushed on the business leader to do it, but I actually had to get in to the weeds with my teams and figure out what was wrong and how do we make it right. But it came from that strategic lens of what are my top 10 growth initiatives and which ones do I think I can move the fastest on and have the greatest odds of success.
Awesome. That's a really good example. Kara, do you want to take it?
Yeah, so honestly, what Joshua shared is very much in line with what I've seen too, over the past decade, but even more precisely over the last 3 or 4 years. You've seen such more of a collaboration between operations and finance. Yeah, we used to be kind of the people imagined with the little green cap in the back of the office, crunching numbers and writing checks. And now it is very much more a part of whatever strategic initiatives there are within the company. And you're seeing more and more finance leaders take positions like CEO and chairman of the board, or much more different positions than finance people usually would climb to in past. And I think that's because there's such a strong strategic need for finance. And then in terms of what you see on the growth side and what we've seen over the past, I would say especially last 2 years since COVID transpired, is the need to act quickly, right? That instant gratification that has transpired within all of our groups that we're involved in has very much led to finance being expected to act very quickly too, right? We used to go through strategic planning sessions and plan out budgets, year, 3 year, 5 year in advance. And we still do that, but they definitely, to Joshua's point, pivot a lot more than I ever saw in my career. And so we have to be very malleable and very easy to be able to implement whatever's coming our way. So now when we're putting plans together, it is very much a plan A, plan B, plan C, all the way down to like a plan F, G, H, because you have to be able to execute whatever's thrown our way.
Absolutely. I think that's something which in all of our industries we've had to deal with over the last few years, like in sort of in the streaming side in particular. It went through a huge amount of growth, and then now it's being challenged a lot on the advertising side. So in my organization, finance and FP&A actually own the KPIs. How about on your ends? Like, how do you think about KPIs? What are some of the most important metrics that you're currently monitoring?
We do a lot in terms of what's actually being done from a cash standpoint, right? So we look a lot of metrics in terms of how quick we're bringing cash in, right? Whether it's days outstanding for sales and making sure that our sales team is aware of that. But also we're driving a lot of different metrics that we weren't before, looking at, what business was done before that wasn't. Some of those things that we used to look at on a quarterly basis, we now look at on a daily basis, right? So on a daily basis, we're looking to see what work orders did we perform that maybe we didn't this time last year on that same date, or if you have certain weather metrics and things like that. We have analytic after analytic after analytic that now we've actually started having to provide almost a summary of analytics, if that makes sense. There's a Power BI report for everything. So it's kind of taking that and now reining it back into just looking at like the 10 most valuable pieces of information. I always like to ask people on our teams, tell me what you would want to tell me if I was stranded on an island somewhere and you could only tell me 10 pieces of information, right? Don't give me 5 pages of analytics. Just give me those high points. So it's almost like we've reversed back to where we were, if that makes sense. It became such an over expansion of data and analytics that now we're trying to just kind of hone it back into what we need to operate the business.
Oh, it definitely makes sense. It's so much more about storytelling and making sure that we're getting straight to the point. Joshua, how about you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, my KPIs vary by the stage, right? And so maybe if I start at the macro stage, being the initial point where I'm building the plan for the company, right? So when I look at that, one of the things that I start with is my market share and how am I growing relative to my competitors. I think back to when I started at Target, And the target we were trying to grow for, pun intended, for Target.com was about 10%. And they thought that was wonderful, right? Well, compared to probably stores at the time growing 2%, that's probably really good. But unfortunately, e-commerce as a whole was growing 15 to 20% a year. So what that meant is we were falling behind and losing market share. And not only that, we were under penetrated. We were behind the times in digital, and we had a lot of catching up to do. So I had to start there, which is understanding like what's our right to win in that space and where should we be at a macro level. And then all of my initiatives that I needed to create to figure out how Target should grow 40 to 50% a year, which was my belief. And I had to convince people of that too, right? Which was not an easy task at the time. They're there now, they're over 10 billion. So good for them. I'm excited to have been a part of that, but I start there. So that's probably one of my first KPIs is what's my market share and how am I growing within either a subset of my business or different areas? How are they performing relative to where they should? Then once I'm looking at my ideas, I would say it's probably closer to what I described earlier with the Eisenhower matrix of, okay, well, what are the things that have the least amount of effort, highest amount of probability, and make sure that we have strong FP&A support to build those business cases and give me, I'd say, some level of comfort that those aren't just like high level numbers that we picked for ourselves, but they actually have some rigor behind them that I can get behind. Once we do that, then it's the course of now you're operating against your initiatives and tracking their performance. And I believe in tracking a couple of things. There's obviously your output KPIs, which would be your growth, your contribution margin, or free cash flow, which is probably one of the most important things to me, right? We can't lose sight of growth for growth's sake. That's not good. We need to make sure that the growth is in service to profit and growth is adding cash. It's not, pulling away our working capital. So those will be the output metrics I look at, but I'm a big believer in also looking to the input metrics that are more specific to those initiatives that give me insight to their performance earlier, right? So those will be things in my space like, how's the conversion going for that? What's the traffic looking like? What am I seeing even for like a net promoter score in terms of maybe a new initiative that I'm launching? How are customers responding to that when I'm in my test phase? So before I scale something, I want to see those leading indicators. And those are incredibly important to me as I think about managing growth initiatives along their life cycle of maturity.
Yeah, just figuring out what your leading indicators are is so important because it gives you a little bit more time to actually react to something which hasn't even happened yet, which I think from the CFO perspective is so important. So I have a question for you actually, Josh. This is going to be an interesting one. So getting ready to become a public company CFO, where you're going to have the pressure of the street every single quarter. What is your philosophy around balancing your short-term performance objectives with your long-term initiatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was fortunate to have grown up kind of in the Bezos school of thought where he's like, market be damned, quarter be damned. We're going to focus on the long term, right?
But not everybody's Amazon, right?
It's true. Not everybody has that luxury. So you do have to have a portfolio approach. So I believe in that, but I definitely bias a little more towards building for the future. But the way I might answer it more specifically for us is I think it also depends on where you're at, right? So if you've got a short-term problem that's a crisis and a threat to the company, you should probably be heavily indexed, if not 90 to 100%, on initiatives that benefit you in the short term to make sure that you're thriving and surviving, and then you can focus on the long term. In a normalized environment, though, I'd want to make sure that it's a balanced portfolio. So I like to have about 10% of my resources focused on efficiency and making the company better, right? So I can harvest that and redeploy it and invest it elsewhere. And then I probably want another, maybe 1% of my EBITDA is a good rule of thumb for what I want to invest into long-term growth initiatives. But my idea on an initiative level is always to ensure that that initiative, I'm spending the least amount possible to determine the viability of that growth initiative before I start scaling it. And then when I'm choosing to go through the scale phase, I will invest infinitely so long as my cash flow is break even. And then anything beyond that, I think is really probably a reflection of where your company's at from a capital perspective. If you're in a hyper growth, which I would define as 30 to 50% growth a year, and you have large amounts of capital, you might be putting the vast majority of your capital in service of growth initiatives. Whereas if you're in a more normalized environment, you need to be a little more thoughtful about that. And maybe it makes up more about 20% of your capital allocation. So I think you've got to look at where you're at in your journey and where you're at relative to your capital stack and your cash flow to make those types of allocation decisions. But you have to have a balanced portfolio, I believe, both short-term and long-term as a rule of thumb.
Awesome. And Kara, I'm pretty sure capital allocation is also a big one in your books. How are you thinking about sort of short-term and long-term objectives and how to balance those?
So we never want to lose sight of our long-term objectives. We call it our VTO, which is our vision and traction kind of organizer. And we start every meeting, that especially ones that involve the entire company, make sure that we're talking about our vision, where we're going, what's our big hairy goal, but also what is our, kind of realistic goal that we're rolling towards for long term. And we want to always make sure that our short-term goals are not going to in any way jeopardize our long-term goals. But yeah, I mean, the short-term goals are always changing, right? Whereas today we may think that what's necessary is implementing a new software that's going to get us from this point to the next stage of our growth. We sometimes have to step back and ask our risk and strategy manager to get involved and actually walk us through 4 steps ahead of that. Is that a smart strategic move to get us to our long-term goal, right? And so we're always looking at that, especially from the financial side. We want to make sure that the money that we have planned to set aside and the things that we need for our growth, whether that's cash reserves or different capital outlays, that we're setting ourselves up for that. So it's always managing it, but kind of keeping your eye on the prize, right? You have to always make sure that you're keeping your long-term goals in mind. But we are very much more of a short-term goal-driven business. Construction is something that is ever changing. We're always kind of having to meet the needs of our clients and adjust ourselves accordingly. So,
do you have an interesting sort of like pivot that you guys have had to do recently, which you'd like to talk to us about?
Sure. Honestly, the recession, whether we want to admit that we're in a recession or not, is beside the point. For us, we put together a budget for this year, and we always put in our budget how much we believe will come from our leak response part of the business, which is our service side, and then how much will come from our replacement side of the business, which is where it's the full capital expenditures from, our building owners. And we were off, I will tell you. And we did a lot of, looking at it, analytics and looking at year-over-year history. And when we put the budget together, we felt pretty confident in it. But I will tell you that we're about 40% higher on leak response and about 19-20% lower on our capital expenditure replacement side of the business. So it all evens out when you look at it from a numbers standpoint. But from a in-house standpoint, where we've had to pivot is who are the players that are in the seat? Because, on your business, you're always looking at, well, this team is concentrated on these efforts and this team is concentrated on these efforts. And if your business model starts adjusting that big of a swing, you have to kind of pivot people in the building to be in the right seat to help you with where you're at right now. So we've done a lot of pivoting, I would say the last 30-45 days, because it's become abundantly clear that we were just a little bit off from where we thought it was going to be. It also helps us look at what we're going to do the next 12 to 18 months, right? Because when you see that big of a shift, you start looking at where your resources the next 12 to 18 months and making sure that we're planning, making sure we have enough people in place to be able to handle the volume that we have coming in. So
that's great. I definitely want to hear more about that people shift when we get into the third part, which is around people and how to maintain focus and momentum, right? In face of disruptive events. So the second part of the panel discussion is around process. And Joshua, maybe you can help us with this a little bit. I'm sure that you're going through some sort of digital transformation during readiness. Do you want to speak to us a little bit about some of the new technologies which are at play, and maybe, a successful implementation or maybe an unsuccessful implementation that you'd like to speak to us about so we can learn from you?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. So I actually gave an Argyle presentation on digital transformation. Probably don't have time for me to repeat my 45-minute presentation, but maybe give you a couple of highlights. It's certainly a topic that I'm passionate about. When I think about digital transformation, though, I probably think of it in a few different lenses and how finance engages, right? There's the digital transformation of the business itself. And certainly as it's from the CFO seat, you will have to be evaluating, are we spending the right resources on that? Are we defining it properly? Is it going to give us the outcomes that we want? And so guiding that as a finance approver, I think, is key. Then there's things like, I would say, transformation within finance ourselves. How are we transforming? And then even on that spectrum, there's full-scale ERP implementations. And then I would say there's like the just do it simple stuff. I love the just do it simple stuff. I would just say that right off the bat. So one of the things that I did in my organization is I created a team that was just dedicated to that. It's an automation team. And their objective is to go through my organization, look for repetitive work and figure out how to automate it and do it better and apply different technologies. And so one of the things that we've done more recently, and we started applying this across the whole company, not just finance, because it was so successful, we found that Power Automate, that's a Microsoft product, was a great tool that was able to engage in a lot of our different technologies, because typically a lot of finance and accounting processes are at the intersection of, I would say, Excel and then some form of ERP, whether it's a standard one or whether it's a custom built one. And so Power Automate was able to navigate most tasks that we did, and we started with vendor payables. Specifically, we had a lot of repetitive button clicking around matching, our payables, and then also approving those and getting them ready so that Treasury could review and release payments. Well, I had a massive team. I had like 20 people in vendor payables. I knew I did not need 20 people in vendor payables. That was too much. And it was a highly manual process. So we created these automations that go through and basically do the basic tasks that we were doing so that my team could spend more time with higher value work going into discrepancies and figuring out how to resolve them with our brands. And so that saved tens of thousands of hours by implementing that. And then we were able to leverage a lot of that technology we had built across the rest of the organization, particularly in our inventory space, where the teams would send off these emails every day to a lot of our brands if they had EDI issues or there was an issue with the PO and it wasn't flowing properly. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of emails. And so we created a script that literally would identify the issue. It would generate the email as a standard template. It would identify who it needed to go to, and then it would send it out and it would CC a human. So when they reply, like, oh yeah, I see that issue, let me work on it. It saved us, I want to say 5 to 10 people we were able to reduce from that process. It was insane. We were paying like 15 people to send emails every week, all week. And so we continue to try and do that across the board. Of course, there's the sexy FP&A planning implementations and forecasting modules, but I actually find that more the efficiency stuff of automating rote processes, not only does it save me resources that I can redeploy, but it also improves the quality of those processes. I think that's one of the things people underappreciate about digital transformation. It's not just about efficiency, it's also about quality, because you remove a lot of the mistakes that human touches can drive and enables us to focus in a different way. So those are some examples in my organization, things that I love, but I really believe in creating dedicated focus. If you assign somebody as their full-time job to just go out there and then they teach, right? So now this team that we created, the automation team, they teach others how to get in and build those things themselves. It's kind of become a cultural transformation for us. It's a way of life. It can't just be an initiative that you do. And so that's probably my biggest advice for anybody trying to do digital transformation is make it part of your culture. It's how you behave in finance and accounting or for your whole company, as opposed to this side initiative that everybody's trying to engage with, if that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. There's no analytics without the correct transactions, and many times it's easy for us to just focus on, as you're saying, the sexy FP&A stuff. But if the journal entries are not right, then there's nothing really to be based on. So I would love, Joshua, if you'd be open to it, to actually be able to share this presentation. Or you said it was recorded. Could we find it online?
I know Argyle has it. I gave it to him, so I'll look for it. Lindsay,
we have to put it in the chat so that everybody who's interested can go. I definitely would love to go and see it. So another question on process, Kari, this one's for you. So how are our CFOs leveraging data analytics to identify growth opportunities to make informed decisions? But maybe we can go into what you were talking about earlier around you're using a Power BI for like so much reporting, but like how are you actually extracting what's important for them from there and making decisions? And maybe instead of just answering it straight, maybe you can give us an example of a decision which you've made based on data that you've been presented.
You know, sometimes it can be as simple as trying to identify where we think we might be at risk of losing a client. So for our company, we have over 115,000 buildings, right, that we're servicing. So when you look at something like that and we start going through, sometimes it is just as simple as we actually have someone that's looking to see, have there been rain events? And if there have been rain events, is this an area where we typically would get business from these particular clients? Did we or didn't we? If our phone isn't ringing in an area from one particular client, then it starts letting us know that we may have an issue and we need to reach out. We use analytics a lot in our business, which sometimes surprises people from a construction standpoint, because we're still a little behind the times on technology in comparison to a lot of other industries. But we use that all the time just to give us an indication where we may have a problem that we need to address. We also have technology that we use when our technicians, what we call check into the site or check out from a site. So we know when they've actually shown up. And if we aren't getting those check-ins, check-outs, then we know that we're probably not performing very well. And so those are other analytics that we're looking at to see. And I mean, there's a plethora that kind of go through that same process, but we are looking at those constantly because they give a lot of information to our sales team on what's missing. From a financial standpoint, we spend a lot of time looking at our days outstanding and seeing if we have any variances. You know, if you have a client that typically pays in 27 days and they start paying at 35 days and then it starts inching to 37 days, we start looking at, do we have a problem? Do we have a client that's starting to slow pay? And, you know, you already know you're going to have that in times of recession where people start holding on to cash longer. So we start trying to be proactive on how can we try to get that those funds in sooner so that we can be proactive. And so same thing from the AP side, right? You start managing, you know, if we typically send that out in 26 days, can we make it 30 days? And then we're holding on to the cash 4 days longer or whatever those things are. So we're constantly looking at the numbers, right? And seeing every day makes a difference. You know, I don't know sometimes if people know that aren't in the finance world and understand that and have been explained, but we explain to our sales teams and to our operations team that every day can mean $210,000 to $340,000 swing based on just one day on your DSO. So those are things that we're always looking at to manage the business.
Those big numbers absolutely help when you're trying to sort of bubble up things and prioritize them. So that's great. So let's talk about people. Karen, maybe you can start us with this one. So what are some of the strategies that you're using to maintain focus and momentum in face of disruptive events?
Oh, you know, I will tell you, good timing. You know, we are always looking to make sure we have the right people on the bus and that they're in the right seat on the bus. That's kind of a term that I know everyone uses, but we use it a lot, just trying to make sure we're doing that. But when you have to disrupt that bus, right, when you have to either move people around or move people off it, there is always a little bit of a hit to your culture. And so because our company culture is so important to us, we're always trying to make sure that we're managing through those processes. And our HR manager is fantastic at kind of helping navigate those and having those conversations. But it really is taking it a step further. As finance people, especially if HR is in our world, it's making sure that you're being strategic. Are you having those conversations before you take action? Are you looking at your 2 and 3 steps ahead to make sure that the actions you're taking is not going to be a financial burden to the company? And you have to look at it from a number standpoint, right? If you're going to let X employee off the bus, have you made sure that you have somebody to pick up the slack where they were, so you're not going to have a misstep on revenue? And so we're always looking at it from that side and making sure our people is our greatest asset. For all of us, it is, right? When you look at your income statement, what's typically your highest cost outside of your cost of goods, right? It's your people. So it's your greatest asset. And it also, if you're not careful, can be your greatest weakness. So.
Absolutely. Josh, maybe we can actually take one of the questions which came from the audience, which is very pertinent into what we're all talking about right now. So what role does finance talent and the CFO, as also the champion of many things in your organization, play in ensuring that your employees aren't burnt out or unhappy?
That's a really good question. Let me think about it for a second. I think maybe the best example that I would give is in resource allocation, right? So as I think about one of the core underappreciated roles of a good CFO, at least one that you should be doing this, right? If you're not, is you should be really focused on the existing resources and how they're allocated. We oftentimes will look at our SG&A budget and be like, oh, that's fixed, that's spent, we're controlling the dollar line. We don't always check how are we deploying those resources across our teams, and are they actually generating the right outcomes, right? And I think it's healthy for any finance leader, not just the CFO, to be talking to your business counterpart that you support and say, hey, you've got 10% of your team over here that are just not delivering. Is that the right resource allocation? Should we change what our teams are working on? And as part of that conversation, I think is a natural form to also have the conversation, are we working on the right things, right? And so we've gone through, at least in our organization, an example that comes to mind for me is a start, stop, and continue exercise. And this is one that I personally led. I'm not going to claim I did a good job at it, but the idea of it I think is good, which is we went across the board and we said, hey, almost like a time study, right? I harken back to my time at Deloitte and public accounting. We all had to write down our time, right? What are we spending our time on? Because we got to build the clients. We would do like a time study, if you will, across the whole organization to say, where are we spending our time? And then what should we stop doing, right? What's low ROI? What should we start doing? What are we not doing today? And I think that's an important exercise for our teams to do as a whole, and then for finance to lean into and say, is that the right way to go about it? And when you do that, it's a good place to say we're doing too much. We need to do less and we need to be more focused. And when you do that, you can help your organization avoid burnout. And I think that type of pacing is really important. So that might be the example that comes to mind for me. And I do think that's a key role that finance can play. Just making sure we're working on the right things first and foremost. And then second is the right pacing and that we are truly stopping. You can't just keep adding and adding and adding. You dilute your effectiveness too. And I think that's something you can use an exercise like that to bring it to the surface.
I'm sure automating a lot of sort of the routine and very repetitive tasks has also helped with your team happiness, right?
Yeah, all my teams love it when you automate a task that they used to do and it just drove them nuts, right? Before.
Yeah.
So that alone, I think, yeah, that's a good reminder. Digital transformation itself is helpful, not just for our finance and accounting teams, but also for our business leaders.
Absolutely. I'm sure nobody enjoyed sending out those emails.
Wow.
Every single one. Kara, how about you? Have you done anything to elevate team morale?
So we actually, a lot of companies have employee resource groups and things like that. We also have what's called an employee engagement committee. So we have about 6 or 7 employees plus a representative from HR that sits on the committee, and they plan events, which we have quite a few people that are remote because we're national and they're kind of all over Alaska, Pennsylvania, California, all over. And so we do collaborative events, whether online and then also at our corporate office that they coordinate. We try to make sure everybody feels heard and involved, and our engagement committee kind of spears that. We also just do simple things like checking in on people. How are you doing? Sometimes that's really all it takes. And thank you. Thank you goes a long way. And a meaningful thank you goes a long way, right? And so we try to take that to heart and always treat people with that respect and appreciation. And when we have people in our management team that aren't doing that, they're probably not going to need a seat on our bus. Because that's what we think is one of the most important things, because it helps drive. I'm a firm believer in that old attitude that people don't leave companies, they leave managers, bosses. And so we try to put a lot of effort into training our management team.
That's great to hear. And I think very, very, very resonant to all of us. Another one from the audience, which is, I mean, we have to address this. I think it's maybe sometimes the fact that we're not addressing it is actually addressing it. Let's talk about AI. So like the hot topic of the moment. So the question from the audience is, how is AI impacting the role of finance, and can you make any predictions as to how the future of automation will continue to impact it? Who wants to take this one?
I mean, I'll be happy to. We actually have someone that's dedicated to artificial intelligence in our office that would report up to our risk and strategy manager, but we use artificial intelligence to scan our roofs. We also use artificial intelligence to provide reports back. We've now started looking at it and implementing it in small places because, again, we're in construction, so we're a little bit behind. But artificial intelligence to actually do some of the simple tasks like schedule meetings, go through emails, look at email chains and see what needs to be done, prioritizing tasks. And of course, you know, use some of the I think it's called Chat GPT or something like that. We've used that to create training. Our marketing manager used this to actually create training that would be able to be duplicated very simply. So it's a human trainer that's not just online, and she's all completely artificial intelligence driven. And it's really neat for new employees that can kind of go through those tasks. We're looking at a lot of other artificial intelligence, but we're trying to tread kind of lightly because it's a little nerve-wracking, right? It's one thing to manage people. It's another thing to manage artificial people, if you will. So, but yeah, we're definitely dipping our toes in a lot of things regarding artificial intelligence.
The scanning tools just make so much sense, right?
Yeah, it's pretty neat. I mean, for us, we have drones that go out, and then we have software that actually is able to see where the deficiencies are, identify them, and then you can actually identify scopes to go with it. And it's very time saving when you look at it, because ultimately there's a labor shortage. I'm sure there are in other industries, but I know in construction there is a labor shortage. So it's not that we're trying to cut the number of people we have, it's that we're trying to scale with the number of people we have to be able to handle more business. So
Joshua, the bar has been set at drones.
Yes.
So.
I don't have anything that cool. Actually, I had a question for you, Kara. What do you use to go through your emails and find what tasks are maybe not being responded to?
So actually we started with, and I'd have to find out what the name of the software they ended up going, but we started with Cortana, which is the Microsoft essentially assistant. And a lot of us, I myself included, just kind of ignored it. And then we had one of our gurus in the office was like, no, this is actually a really cool thing. And so we use something that integrates. It actually takes our Outlook, our Microsoft Outlook, and integrates it with Slack, which is our communication tool. And it kind of marries the two together and then scans it and gives you in a Slack bot. It's called a Slack bot. And the Slack bot actually tells you what you have for the day, what you haven't responded to, any meetings you have, and then it actually sends you reminders throughout the day. So I don't know exactly how they set it all up, but it is the neatest thing, because I just get a Slack that tells me, hey, we've looked at your Microsoft Outlook, and this is what you have. This is what you need to respond to. These are open tasks. So
I don't know if I want it anymore, because if it shows me how many things I've not responded to, that would make me depressed.
It's kind of, it's a neat tool though, because for me, it kind of is mind-boggling how it's able to do it, but it's very neat the way it does that. So
that's awesome. Yeah. So to answer your question more specifically, I would say for us as a company, there's certainly a lot of AI opportunities, and we certainly are testing and leveraging them in certain areas. The more logical ones for us, right, our customer service, replies, as well as listing optimization, content generation for digital marketing, etc. I always try to avoid too many predictions. I've been in e-commerce for close to 2 decades. A lot of my predictions have been false. Some of them have been correct, but AI is transforming rapidly. I would be shocked though if we don't have far more AI automating our workflows, but it's going to require our workflows to be standardized and structured, as well as our data to be structured enough to ensure that that's accurate. So I would foresee a lot of that for at least a digital business like ours. In terms of finance, though, which I think was the core of the question, similarly, I would expect it to be more applicable to AP/AR type stuff, anywhere where there's a lot of emails and you've got to get a question, figure out which is the right reply. I don't have anything in place on that yet. Those are one of the things that I would say is in testing for us, that we need to figure out how to share our internal data and teach them on what are our protocols and what is a good reply, right, to a vendor potentially, and analyzing their statement and figuring out the reconciliation, right, between invoice and our systems, and then responding accordingly. And beyond that, of course, there's always been promise of machine learning to have the best forecast in the world. I've never seen that come to fruition, to be frank. And we had some of the best PhD economics at Amazon. There's certainly certain places that can be applicable, but I do think you're going to continue to need humans to review the forecast. And I think AI will be an important part of it. That's something that I would say I'm watching with cautious optimism to see how that will change. Where I probably see most applicability is in FP&A, analyzing large complex data sets and coming back with insights. So that's an area that we've been starting to test in my organization, and I'm excited to kind of see the future of that. It's not quite where I probably would want it to be to fully rely on it, but that is one area that I would be a little more optimistic that they could scale large data sets and come back and say, hey, here's the things that are most off. These are the things you should look into, type of thing.
Yeah, that's awesome. So last question for today. We all look at each other and at business leaders for some inspiration on, sort of quick tips on how we can sort of apply something which they're doing in their day-to-day lives to make us more effective, more productive, more successful. Let's talk a little bit about what you use on your day-to-day to keep up to date on market trends, industry developments, and sort of any news outlets that you're consistently looking at and monitoring to keep ahead of the game in your roles.
It's a great question. I can go first and let Kara close that, because I think she's got a better answer here than me. She seems much more well-read. I will say, for me, it's a little more simple, right? I'll admit, I read the Wall Street Journal. I learn a lot from that, which is helpful. I talk to my peer set, right? Just try and stay abreast of what's going on for others in similar situations. Try and draw out those insights. And then honestly, LinkedIn is, if you can sift through, what trends to be more the advertisements nowadays, there's actually a lot of substance on there that helps me stay a little abreast of what people are dealing with and what they're doing. And then certainly forums like Argyle are fantastic, right? To hear what's going on. And so those are, I'd say, my primary ones. I probably spend a little too much time internally focused on the business and trying to make it better. And I don't spend a ton of time externally, but when I do have time, that's probably those are my sources, I would say.
Yeah, so I have a couple that I rely on. So I'm on the board for CFMA, which is Construction Financial Management Association. For us, it's very helpful. They have a lot of people on staff that kind of sift through all of the mountains of information there is out there, and then provide us kind of market trends, coin indexes, a lot of economic forecasting and things like that. So I rely a lot on that. And then also just simple things like Alpha and Owler. I just get their daily alerts, and I don't spend a lot of time going through them, but I just glance at them each morning. I'm an early riser, right? So up at 4 a.m. and I'm looking through to see if there's anything that maybe might be a little nugget that might help throughout the day. I do spend time on LinkedIn. Agree with that. I always find some really interesting things on there. But yeah, very similar to you, Josh. I wish I had time to be able to do more of that. And honestly, it's just there isn't a lot of time in the day. I am also very fortunate. Our CEO tends to get a lot of those different things. He reads the Wall Street Journal and he reads the Dallas Morning News and the New York Times and all these other ones. And he seems to read them pretty thoroughly and sends us things he finds interesting. So I rely on that too, and what he does.
I mean, that's always a great source, right? If you have somebody in your entourage who's sort of giving you the daily digest. Well, it's been absolutely great getting to know the two of you and learning from you. To all of our participants today, please make sure to look up Kyra and Joshua on LinkedIn. They have really, really interesting backgrounds and profiles, and you can continue to learn from them there. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I have.
Well, and thank you guys so much for an awesome panel discussion. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. This officially concludes the Argyle CFO Summit. Thank you again for joining us today and engaging in our content. Have a great rest of your day.